Good morning and welcome to Sharversations. Happy Juneteenth. We're a national holiday. Yay! It's a start. It's a step forward, and it's a couple steps backwards because the teachers aren't allowed to teach the truth. So parents, you're up. You know what you have to do. So I hope you brought your coffee with you. I have one that says Charlotte on it. Of course, it's backwards to you, but anyway, and it's got a little pink and green in it. All right. Your coffee, your tea, whatever you use to get started in the morning, hopefully something legal. All right. So, got a little jazz going on right now. I went and got my shot today. Yay! I was like one of the rebels. Like, I don't want to do this. And thanks to my sister Kathleen, talked to me about Pfizer, and I said, okay, it's time. So, all right, let's get to it. I'm going to be doing a series, and it's called Behind Closed Doors. This will be part 1, and we're talking about domestic violence. Yes. And part 2, we'll talk about generational secrets. That's also behind closed doors. That'll be next week. All right, so let's get into it. All right. Thank you so much, Norman Connors. I do not own the rights to the music. All right, so domestic violence is a pandemic within itself. A pandemic within a pandemic, if I might say. And let's define it. So we have a clear understanding of what we're talking about. So domestic violence is an act or a threatened act of violence upon someone with whom the perpetrator is or has previously been in an intimate relationship. It can be a verbal or a physical assault. Now, I don't think people really think about this part of domestic violence, but it's also linked to child abuse, because what happens, things get verbal, then things get physical between the partners, and then the children, of course, they're going to try to intervene, and then they end up getting hurt. So it's domestic violence is linked to child abuse by children not necessarily physically injured, but watching, hearing it. A parent being abused can have severe psychological implications, and it can affect them later in life. I can distinctly remember an incident between my parents. They were arguing, and I was in bed, so I'm supposed to be asleep. But the argument got loud, and I knew that if my dad was intoxicated, that it was going to turn physical. So I ran out, and I'm yelling for them to stop. And he threw a hot cup of coffee at my head, over my mom's head. I ducked, of course, but we had a German Shepherd, and Brutus headed towards Dad's jugular. He literally leaped from the kitchen where he was. And Mom and I both yelled the dog's name, and the dog stopped. And I ran over and hugged the dog. And when he realized what happened, he chilled. Okay. He just, stumbled onto the bedroom and went on to sleep. But it has an effect. Here I am so many years later, we won't say, and I can still remember that moment. So that's what I'm talking about. Okay, so domestic violence is often looked at as a vicious cycle, and it is. I remember when I volunteered at a homeless shelter. It was a domestic violence shelter for women and children. And they would come in and they would just be beat up. The kids would just be shaken. So, one person was assigned to the mother and somebody else was assigned to the children. And it's just a cycle, because this is what happens. Statistics say that a woman will go back to that abusive situation at least 7 times before they finally stop or they kill their abuser. And we saw that happen. I was like, yeah, but he loves me. This is how the cycle starts. The tension builds up in the relationship. The victim does something, that the abuser doesn't like. And then the victim tries to keep the abuser happy. But eventually it turns into an incident, and then the violence happens. Then the abuser apologizes, and they attempt to make up, and they give gifts, and there's this honeymoon period where everything is honky-dory until another episode, and then the cycle repeats over and over. Without intervention, this cycle of the making up and calm, it will stop, and then it's just straight violence. And the reason I wanted to talk about this subject because we're still in a pandemic, and when the initial lockdown happened, I had two concerns. One was for my recovering addicts. The other was for those who are in a domestic violence situation. Now you're locked in with your abuser. And I thought about the children, because when I did social work for a while, we had to go into the households and see that. And I found something interesting. I was looking online, I'm always doing research, and I found an article, and they were saying how, when this whole pandemic and lockdown happened, they were concerned, like the domestic hotlines were concerned. They knew that they were going to have to rev up people because they expected the increase. Well, surprisingly, it decreased by 50%. And I know you're wondering, well, why would that happen? Well, let me tell you why. They didn't have access to get to a phone to call for help. They were stuck. Where were they going to go? And there was nothing set in place. No crisis plan was set in place because there was no time, for any code word to be used. If somebody did call to check on them, and that's what happened. All right, so I'm getting ahead of myself. All right, so listen, domestic violence is in direct opposition with God's plan for families. Let's go to Ephesians 5:25. It says, husbands, love your wives just as Christ loved the church and gave his life for the church. So that means if you're loving your wife the way Christ loved the church, and Christ loved the church, he didn't hurt the church. So why are you hurting your wives? All right, and I hear you Bible scholars saying, yes, but chapter 5 talks about submissions too, being submissive. Okay, let's talk about it briefly. We're not going to go into a whole Bible study. So, Ephesians chapter 5, I looked at the New Living Translation. That whole chapter talks about living in the light, living by the Spirit's power, and Spirit-guided relationships with wives and husbands. So, I'm just going to pick out some points in verses 21 to 23. Verse 21, and further submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. Okay? For this, verse 22, for wives, this means submit to your husbands as to the Lord. Verse 25, for husbands, this means love your wives just as Christ loved the church. Okay? In verse 28, it says, in the same way that Christ loved the church, husbands ought to love their wives as they love their own bodies. Now, men don't normally self-inflict abuse on themselves. So if you're loving your wife the way you love yourself, then why are you hurting your wife? All right. No one hates his own body. True. We may not like a couple things. We got little lumps and bumps or whatever, but we don't hate our body. Okay? But we feed it. We care for it, just as Christ cared for the church. You see where I'm going? Okay. Verse 33, which is the last verse in that chapter. It says, so again, I say. Notice he's saying this a few times. So that means, when something is repeated in the Bible, it has some importance. All right, so again, I say, each man must love his wife as he loves himself, and the wife must respect the husband. Respect, not be a doormat. Okay. All right. So those who are currently in a domestic violence situation needs to do anything and everything possible to get out, because safety first. I don't care how much you love. Oh, that's my man. Okay, but he's hurting you. You got sunglasses on because you're hiding bruises. Come on. All right, we have to do better. Now, let me give you this information. I'm going to put it in the comments as well. The National Domestic Violence Hotline is 800-799-7233. 800-799-7233. They kept that number simple so you don't have a whole lot of keystrokes. Okay, online it's www.thehotline.org. Now listen, if you're in a domestic situation and your abuser is tracking your internet, use, make sure you delete your searches. Okay, so when you get there, contact them, do put the information in, delete it. Okay, if you make a phone call or send a text message, delete it. That's for your safety. Okay, when domestic violence is ongoing, safety is the first step. And especially if you have children, don't submit them to this. They're seeing and hearing this. Even though you may be able to fight back and all that, after a while, it's not going to work. All right. Know this, that even after the victims are physically safe and the bodily injuries have been healed, you still have emotional and psychological scars that run deep. And those wounds take time to heal. And you need a professional counselor to guide you through that healing process. Let me say this. Some people question God, like, where were you when this abuse was going on? Where were you? Why did you leave me? Listen, God didn't leave you, okay? He saw, he knows what happened. He probably provided a couple ways of escape, okay? But you might not have taken them, or maybe you didn't see them. But every situation is different. Everybody goes through something differently. But know this, domestic violence or an intimate partner violence, whatever you want to call it, it hurts the heart of God for both the abuser and the person being abused, okay? He did not abandon you. And God's desires that all involved, the abuser and the person who was abused, be healed and whole. So no, God didn't abandon you. He sees, he knows what's going on. Trust me, it's not going to last for long, especially when you proclaim to be a child of God. He protects you. You got to pray. And then when you see the way of escape, go. Don't stop. All right. I pulled this article off the internet too. And it's called The Pandemic Within a Pandemic. And it talked about some things here. With people who were confined to their homes when this whole lockdown happened, advocates expressed concern for a potential increase. And they thought it was going to increase, and it probably did, but they didn't receive the calls. They didn't get the help. They didn't hear the calls for help. But there are things, and this is what I've liked about this article, that can be put in place. First of all, 1 in 4 women and 1 in 10 men experience intimate abuse. Well, they call it, have a new buzzword instead of domestic violence, they call it intimate partner violence. And it can come in several forms. Some people always think it's physical. It's not always physical. It can be verbal. My first marriage was like that. It was verbal. Everybody's like, oh, but he's quiet and laid back. Yeah, but behind closed doors, oh, it was a whole nother story. Okay? It can be emotional. It can be sexual. It can be psychological. I remember there was an issue one time, and people were like, well, is it true that you can be in a husband and wife situation and still get raped? And it's like, yeah. If the wife says no, it's supposed to be no. And a lot of times, it's like, yes, it is. And that's rape. When it's against your will and you don't want it, that's rape. It doesn't matter what your excuse is. Maybe you're just not feeling it that night. So, we all have our moments. And then if it's forced upon you, that's still rape, even though that's your husband. Yeah, I said it. All right. So, especially in communities of color and other marginal groups, because, you've got economic instability, unsafe housing, neighborhood violence, it's lack of safe and stable child care, social support. It's already a worse situation, and it's already tense. So then you add this pandemic of being locked down, and then you have the fact that you're locked in with your abuser. That's a lot to deal with. IPV cannot be addressed without also addressing the social factors, especially in the context of a pandemic that is causing substantial isolation. Okay? We got to be careful. Also, our children have been affected. Mandated reporters such as teachers, child care providers, clinicians, social workers have fewer interactions. If you're doing it virtual, you can't see what's going on. You don't know what's going on in that house. And there's fewer opportunities to assess, recognize, report signs of abuse, even more so before the pandemic. I mean, it was bad enough before the pandemic. You know, people were trying to hide things, but you saw signs. So if you're there in person, but virtual, you can't see any signs. Okay, but here's some things that can be done. Providers can continue to screen for domestic violence and discuss safety planning with their patients, doing telemedicine appointments, even when a lot of people are having virtual doctor appointments. And if your abuser is not in the room, you can say, listen, this is my code word. If I say this word, that means I'm in trouble. Please send the police. Okay? It could be a phrase. It could be anything. They gave some examples here. When it's safe to have a discussion about IPV, clinicians, doctors, whomever, can review the safety practices such as deleting internet browsing history, which I mentioned, and text messages, saving hotline information under other listings. Like you can put it under Cousin Sue, and that's the hotline. Okay? So when the hotline has to call you back, oh, that's just my cousin, and you can talk in code. They understand code, trust me. I used to work on the hotline, so I know how that goes. Such as a grocery store or pharmacy listing, and creating new and confidential email account for receiving information about resources and communicating with clinicians. This is serious, people. We have a second wave coming, and we have to prepare. We don't know whether we're going to be shut down again. This wave that's coming from India, we don't know. But I'm just putting it out there. If you're in a situation and you feel like you don't have any control, trust and believe you can. I can remember there was a video, I think it was on Instagram or Facebook one, where this woman actually was in a grocery store and her abuser was with her, and she wrote something on the receipt. I think it was like, help me or something. And one of the people saw it, and what they did was she asked for an item that she knew they would have to look for, and it gave them time to get the police there, and she was out of that situation. I said, that was awesome. That was good thinking, quick thinking on her part. So we have to do what we have to do. And then people we are our neighbor's keeper. Watch when you're out. Just look at people. Just look around you. See what's going on. And if you see something looking kind of funny, you may not have to get directly involved, but you can call 911 and say, listen, there's a situation going on in the Trader Joe's parking lot. I don't know what's going on, but you'll see it when you get here. But this is what's happening. And they will send somebody out. And then you can always do a wellness check. If you think that you can't reach your loved one or something, there may be an abusive situation, ask for a wellness check. This way they don't come with guns blaring. They already know, okay, this may be a mental health situation, or it could be a domestic violence situation. But do something. Don't just look at it and be like, and keep going. You know how we do. Come on, sometimes we got to get involved. Okay? I hope this was informational. I'm going to put that information in the comments. And thank you for joining Conversations. See you next week.